UV light produces this complex prohormone in the body called pro-opiomelanocortin, or POMC. POMC is cleaved into 10 different hormonal products, one of which is beta endorphin, which is a natural opioid that the body makes in response to UVB light in particular. Whenever you are exposed to full spectrum light, you're getting the maximum possible expression of this beta endorphin, which not only improves mood, reduces anxiety, depression, but also improves overall dopamine status. We're not getting these natural impetuses for dopamine production that help us kind of cruise at altitude and feel good all day long. So instead, we have to get on the dopamine roller coaster. All that is your body saying we need dopamine and we're not getting it from our environment, which means we need to go seek it out. Vitamin D is something a lot of people supplement with, but all of the big trials like the VITAL study showed no benefit to supplementing with vitamin D on any chronic disease states, despite the fact that vitamin D deficiency is highly associated with the incidence and severity of multiple different disease states. So if we look at the total burden on our healthcare system, clearly the risk-benefit is much weighted towards the benefit of getting more sun exposure and not the risks, given that the benefits are supporting the amelioration or the prevention of diseases that are the biggest burdens on our healthcare system.
Alexis, for you, when it comes to health optimization, a big piece of this is making our mitochondria healthy. So let's start out talking about what the mitochondria are and why they're so important.
The mitochondria, people may have heard of them as the powerhouse of the cell, but I'm really interested in making mitochondria great again, which is a slogan that I'm actually trademarking right now, because if we look at the chronic disease epidemic that we're facing, if we actually go down to the root of what's happening, this is really mitochondrial dysfunction in one or more tissues, underlying diabetes, obesity, autoimmune conditions, neurodegeneration, cancer, ... So mitochondria are much more than simply powerhouses, as we learn in, let's say, high school. But mitochondria are also making a special type of water called deuterium-depleted metabolic water. Mitochondria are also making light. So biophotons are a major output of mitochondrial metabolism. There's something called the electron transport chain, or the ETC, which, if anybody took an intro bio class, you've probably learned about that. That is the process by which mitochondria can make energy in the form of ATP, but through that cascade is also the production of biophotons and also the production of this deuterium-depleted metabolic water. We can get into why that's important, maybe a little bit later, but suffice to say for now that it's much different than the water that you're drinking. This water has special properties that allows the mitochondria to work more efficiently and do what they need to do to support overall tissue function, cellular health, and also health of the overall organism as well. And so the main inputs into mitochondria, in addition to, people think about macros, let's say. When you break down macros, you're essentially breaking them down into electrons and protons. Everything else gets stripped away, and those electrons and protons are ultimately the input into mitochondria, into that electron transport chain. But another primary input or influence on mitochondrial function is the electromagnetic environment. So I really like to think about mitochondria as both an electromagnetic antenna and an emitter. As I mentioned, mitochondria are making biophotons. Photons, light equals electromagnetism. So when we're talking about light, we're talking about both light that we can see, but also light that we can't see as well. And most of the light in the universe is light that we cannot see. Roy G. Biv, the red through violet, are the only frequencies that are in the visible part of the spectrum. But outside of that, on the red end, we have infrared, so that's like heat. And on the violet end, we have ultraviolet, or UV, which is at the shorter wavelength end of things. And we'll definitely get into the importance of UV light and infrared light in this conversation, because when it comes to mitochondrial function and health, UV and IR light really are the stars of the show here. But just to kind of circle back, when we're thinking about electromagnetism in mitochondria, we have both these photons being produced, but also mitochondria sensing the electromagnetic environment very exquisitely. So if you look at the research on non-native EMFs, for example, 5G, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, etc., these frequencies directly interface with the mitochondria, and they kind of create, you can kind of think of it as like decoherence, or creating kind of some chaos or a lack of an ability to properly sense the environment, because these frequencies are not natural, so to speak. They're a very new phenomena within our environments, emerging over the past 100 years. Really with the rollout of the AC power grid, and then of course all of our technology that we plug into walls, and then light bulbs, and then all of the tech that we all enjoy today that we're talking on right now. But these frequencies, if you could see them, they are also forms of light that are interacting with our bodies. And the research going back to even the 50s, 60s, 70s, the work of Robert O. Becker and Alan Fry, who were both like superstars within the non-native EMF research space back in the 50s and 60s, we've known for a very long time that these frequencies cause huge issues. It's actually also kind of interesting to consider that although Alan Fry and Becker were active at the same time, Becker was really studying both the harms of non-native EMFs on biological systems, but also the regeneration pathways, about what to do about it essentially, and how to combat these frequencies and forces to actually support cellular health and regeneration. And Fry was really just focused on the negative consequences of exposure and what you could basically make happen through, let's say, targeted use of non-native EMFs as an example. And he was somebody who studied the Havana syndrome and other effects like this. So funnily enough, in the 70s, Becker got canceled after blowing the whistle on 60 Minutes for exposing the harms of non-native EMFs on human biology. Because there was this antenna going up somewhere in the Midwest. It ended up in Michigan, I think, but it was called the sanguine antenna. And it used ELF frequencies, extreme low frequency waves. And he found that was very problematic because the ELFs mimic the natural ELF frequencies that we receive, namely the Schumann resonance, which is like this heartbeat of the earth that actually helps to sync up the body's rhythms to the natural environment. And so he found that if you provide interfering wavelengths within this ELF space, that you basically can ruin the rhythms that are present, that are getting naturally synced up to the environment, and you can get some serious health issues, circadian issues, metabolic health issues, etc. And so he ended up blowing the whistle on 60 Minutes. And within a few days, all of his funding had been pulled, and he lost his livelihood, his lab, and ended up writing books and kind of trying to make some waves and bring awareness to the space, but didn't end up a researcher anymore after that. Versus Fry, he's still alive, actually. Apparently he lives somewhere in Maryland. I would love to kind of talk to him at some point if he's up for it, but he didn't have any issues getting funding for his research, and he was able to keep going. And I think part of that is that if we, let's say, talk about the military-industrial complex, for example, it's very useful information to know how these frequencies can be weaponized versus the regeneration pathways. One could put their tinfoil hat on and say, this information is less advantageous for the population to know, because then basically the powers that be can't have influence over people leveraging these frequencies. And that also relates back directly to Havana syndrome and everything like that. There was huge issues at the American embassy in Russia where multiple ambassadors in a row got some weird cancers, lymphomas, and other things. And it was because they were basically using directed energy weapons at the embassy. And some reports for the time suggest that was Russia trying to send a message to the US that these frequencies are actually harmful and they shouldn't be rolled out in that way. And I know Russia has a lot of more strict laws around non-native EMFs for their population relative to what we have here, which is basically the Wild West, to the point where the 1996 Telecommunications Act basically says, it does say that cell communication networks can put their towers anywhere they want. It can be next to a school, a hospital, a nursing home, wherever they want. Nobody can stop them from doing that, which isn't the policy in many other countries, even within Europe. So I think we just have a ton that we need to learn and inform about in this area, because it's wreaking havoc on our health, and people see it as a tinfoil hat issue, but it's really a very tangible problem that there is decades of research to support that this is actually an issue for human health. And so building awareness on it is really important, and it directly ties into this mitochondrial story, because it is negatively influencing mitochondrial function, which then has all of these knock-on effects to health on the whole.
That was a great overview. And as you're sharing that, it gets me thinking about all these different inputs on the mitochondria. And for each of them, whether it be diet, light, EMFs, it seems like there's a positive and a negative input. So we want to be taking these things in a healthy way and blocking the negative. So let's continue with the EMF piece and talk about the actual healthy EMFs. You mentioned the Schumann resonance. There's also EMF we get from the sun. So let's talk about that in a healthy dose response to our biology.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are certain inputs that our bodies are just expecting to receive because, evolutionarily or ancestrally speaking, those were the inputs that we did receive and that our bodies were shaped under. So that includes the Schumann resonance, which is this heartbeat of the Earth. This includes the Earth's magnetic field. This includes full spectrum sunlight at different times of day, which the spectrum of sunlight varies depending on the time of day. Early morning and late evening sunlight is highly enriched in red and infrared light and has much less blue light and no UV light, UVA or UVB. And then as that sun approaches midday, we have the peak of the shorter wavelength blue and UV light. And then, of course, that kind of wanes over the course of the day. So there are different, you can kind of think about it as like a combinatorial effect. So if we think about Morse code, for example, a series of dots and dashes, I really like to think about light at different times of day as an information that's encoded into our biology that allows our bodies to understand what's going on in our environment. So in the morning time, like I mentioned, we're getting dots and dashes in the forms of red and infrared light predominantly. And then as that sun starts approaching high noon, we're getting more of this encoded information that is relaying the fact that blue and UV light are coming into the spectrum. And that means certain things, right? Because if we're talking about timing, how does the body keep time? I mean, actually the conversation around like the thermodynamics of timekeeping and clocks in general within like the physics of how clocks work is actually really interesting. But the body has multiple mechanisms by which it can use to tell time. It has to do with light intensity, light spectrum, whether food is available, how active somebody is, whether they're digesting and assimilating nutrients, whether they're using their brain and their cognition a lot. These are all kind of daytime activities associated with the circadian rhythm. The circadian rhythm is primarily set by the blue light in the environment. So the SCN, the master clock in the brain, is connected directly to the back of the eye, the retina. And there's something called the RHT, the retinohypothalamic tract, that detects blue light in the environment and then relays that message to that master clock in the brain to say, hey, we're maximizing blue light, which means it must be around midday, or hey, there's no blue light, essentially, it must be nighttime. And that engages different systems within the body. So when blue light is at its peak, like I mentioned, we're maximizing for cognition, digestion, movement. And if there's no blue light, the absence of blue light signals nighttime and darkness. So we need both an absence of blue light, but also bright light as well, because bright light in itself is also a signal that it's daytime. And actually, just to kind of circle back to that briefly, this is a problem that people have on both sides of the equation. So people aren't getting enough full spectrum light during the day, but they also aren't getting enough bright light during the day. And if you think about a sunny day, we're looking at upwards of 100 to 200,000 lux, which is a measure of brightness, compared to most indoor environments are maxing out around 1,000 or 2,000 lux. So we're talking about a 100-fold difference here in brightness that actually helps to stimulate the production of serotonin in the pineal gland. That serotonin gets turned into melatonin later at night when it gets dark out. So I always like to point that out because people will think, okay, I just need a dark environment at night in order to get good sleep. But also you need bright full spectrum light during the day in order to get good sleep that night as well, because you need to make that serotonin precursor that also makes you feel good and alert and connected. But that gets turned into melatonin later when that blue light and bright light goes away. So both the light and the dark are equally important in this conversation. And that also refers to the fact that this is a decentralized system, as Jack Kruse says, because there's basically not one controller, there's two. It's light and it's dark, and not one is more important than the other. And so when we're thinking about, the environments that we're inhabiting today, like I said, bright light is at a major deficit indoors, but then also a lot of blue light and artificial light is predominating at nighttime when it's supposed to be dark out. So people are, as soon as the sun goes down, they're putting on their energy efficient, quote unquote, LED or fluorescent bulbs, which are highly enriched in blue light and completely devoid of red and infrared light. They're on their phones, their computers, their TVs, which are also all enriched in blue light as well. And so now at nighttime, we're sending the signal that it's daytime because of this highly blue enriched light that is completely imbalanced. And I want to mention that as well, because as it relates to the mitochondria story, Blue light actually directly impairs mitochondrial function and inhibits mitochondrial metabolism. And so in nature, we're always meant to receive blue light with an abundance of red and infrared light, because red and infrared light, on the other hand, has a very stimulating and supportive effect on mitochondria. So these red and infrared frequencies directly stimulate mitochondrial metabolism and help the mitochondria to make more metabolic water, light, and energy in the form of ATP. So in nature, blue light is always yoked to red and infrared light to counterbalance the effects of blue. But in our indoor environments, we're not only, being bombarded with blue light in isolation that is also impairing our mitochondrial function directly, but then even if it's daytime and, we have a lot of quote unquote natural light in the rooms from windows, we're still concentrating blue because standard window glass filters out most near infrared light and almost all UVB light and about 30% of UVA light. So in essence, you're concentrating the blue part of the spectrum simply by filtering out some of the more beneficial counterbalancing frequencies from natural light as it filters through glass. So we're basically doing everything wrong indoors when it comes to our light environments. And of course, if you're indoors, most people are also not grounding, which is really, really important feature of being in nature as well. And it's a way that our body's able to yoke to these natural rhythms like the Schumann resonance, like Earth's magnetic field. But grounding, electrical grounding, is essentially when our bodies can connect to the electrical circuit of the Earth and we can get a balancing of protons and electrons in our system. So you can basically discharge excess positive charge when you're grounding, when you're connected to the Earth. And there's, ton of research on this showing that even just 25 minutes of grounding will dramatically reduce the inflammatory status of somebody's body. And they can look using thermography and you can see literally the heat is being removed from these inflamed parts of the body simply by being grounded. And if you think about our ancestors, even about 100 years ago, everybody was virtually grounded all the time because we didn't have synthetic materials that were blocking that grounding force from acting on us. So if you think about cotton, leather, linen, all of these materials are going to be allowing and permitting that grounding force to still happen. But then today, of course, we're walking around with these petroleum product-based soled shoes and, our homes aren't grounded. There's polyurethane covering the floors, things like this, and, polyester socks, things like this that are preventing you from getting that grounding. And so we're basically just walking around with a ton of static, which can also exacerbate the inflammatory status because, again, now you're not giving your body the ability to discharge that excess positive charge. And so between the grounding, the lack thereof, and the light environments, when it comes to electromagnetism, we're living in, basically a dystopian reality indoors. And of course, you have to add in the non-native EMF part of the equation in there too. So we're both not getting the good EMFs, and we're also getting a ton of the bad non-native EMFs as well that are confusing the heck out of the mitochondria. And what I always like to say is one of the greatest ways to offset non-native EMF exposure is to get plenty of native EMF exposure. But, if we're inside, it's not very easy to do that. Of course, there are some ways you can hack your indoor environment. But by and large, most people, of course, aren't doing those things, but that's also why I'm trying to advocate and inform people so we can make better decisions and kind of take charge of our own health versus needing to go to a doctor when there's a crisis, just preventing the crisis to begin with by building out your foundations of health.
As you're talking there about indoor environment, it gets me thinking about another subdivision here where with these inputs, we can use light as an example, we can go back to nature, spending time outside, getting natural daylight, and I would assume that would be best. But then for each of these, there's incorporating it into our modern lifestyle and hacking it, like the light you have shining on you right now. So again, another subdivision, and I think that's a good way to approach each of these inputs for somebody out in nature, the best way to enhance it. And then the reality is we live in the 21st century and it's near impossible for most of us to live that way. So what can we do in the home to biohack that?
Yeah, one of the benefits of being a modern human right now is that a lot of people do have the ability to work remotely, which means that you can optimize your home environment and potentially what I like to tell people is instead of spending money on dubious supplements, spend money building an outdoor space that's functional, that you enjoy spending time in, And then you can kind of kill two birds with one stone. You can get some work done. You basically create a shaded environment so that you can be on your computer out there. You can see the screen while you're also sitting in the sun potentially and grounding as well, ideally. So that's the ideal work environment. Obviously, it's wet outside today, so I'm not out there, but usually I take my podcast outside for better or worse because there can be some like distracting background sounds, but it's a worthy trade-off in my opinion, and my mic is actually pretty good. So I recommend for people who are gonna be recording and things like that, like getting a good mic that filters out ambient sound, getting a setup where, you can ground while you're, maybe sitting at like a patio set. But for people who are going to work inside and need to work inside, there are a lot of different tools that we can leverage to help counterbalance some of the, let's say, non-native EMFs and blue light. So right now I'm using Chroma Sky portals. They clamp onto the edge of your desks. They get about 10,000 lux a piece. I've got 2 of them on me right now. So they're very bright. They have tunable brightness and tunable redness, so you can adjust based on the time of day, how bright it is, and how red/amber it is. So when it's, at nighttime, you can have it on red or amber mode and at a dim setting, and then during the day, we can have it on a brighter white setting. Incandescent bulbs. This is another thing I'm actually really passionate about talking about because as it stands, the incandescent bulbs are set to be completely banned in 2028. And some people believed that when Trump first got into office here in the States that was reversed, but it was not reversed. We actually need to go back and revise the 2008 energy bill, which is what set the standards it's basically incandescent bulbs aren't being directly banned. What is the problem is the standards being set, which is basically energy consumption per light output. And the light that they're considering as an output is only visible light. They see infrared light and UV light as a waste because they're not contributing to the brightness, because they're not part of the visible spectrum. They're not considering the fact that UV and infrared light are essential nutrients that the body requires to be healthy. If we thought about light from a health perspective and as essential nutrients, we can think about the different frequencies as such, then it would become very clear what kind of light bulbs we need to be optimizing for in our indoor spaces. So as it stands right now, you can still buy incandescent bulbs. I personally get all mine from healthlighting.com. And I actually, in all of the rooms of the house that we use light bulbs during the day, I put in the lizard basking bulbs. So they're 100 watt and they contain UVA light as well. So it's more similar to sunlight than, any other bulb you're going to be getting essentially. And the higher the wattage, the incandescent bulb, the brighter it's going to be. So you just have to make sure that your fixtures are compatible with a higher wattage device, or you can get new fixtures as well. But you want to make sure that you're getting as bright as possible because we do want that bright full spectrum light during the day to support our neurochemistry, our energy, our circadian health, and also our sleep later in the day. So those are some of the light fixtures that I like to use. And then with regards to grounding, I often recommend people get grounding mats, sheets, things like that. But what I usually tell people is if you can, try to ground them directly into the earth. So what that means is you'll have to run the wire instead of plugging into an outlet, you'll run it out a window. And if you need more leeway, you can get some insulated copper wire, coil it around the probe that would go into the outlet, and then run the copper wire out the window and just bury a little coil of it in the ground so that you're directly connecting to the earth. And whenever you're using a grounding device, you always want to test it and actually make sure you're grounded when you're on it, because jump conduction is real, dirty electricity is real, and you don't want to be thinking you're doing something good for your body, but you're actually getting, a dose of non-native EMFs essentially, depending on where that cord is grounded into. And even if it's grounded into the earth, if there's like buried wires or something nearby, that would potentially influence your ability to get a good solid ground from that placement. So just some considerations there, and people can use just a standard voltmeter to test whether they're grounded. I have a highlight reel on my Instagram called Grounding Test that has like a bunch of different things that I tested, like products that I have used, like a wristband, mats, mattress topper, to name a few, and it shows you basically how to set it up and how to test it to make sure that you're grounded. So that's what I recommend on the grounding front. And if you're going to be, inside with windows, just try to crack them even just a little bit to let some natural light through is way better than just keeping it completely shut. So if weather permits, you can open windows, you can open doors and have light coming in through screens. That's full spectrum light. The screen's not filtering out anything. Obviously, if you look at the screen, there's a bunch of holes. For some reason, people ask me that. They're like, are screens okay? And I'm like, yes. The natural light is coming through. And so you can totally leverage that as well to help improve the quality of your indoor environments.
When it comes to the grounding mats, if somebody were to set it up the way you described, tested it, is that pretty close to having your feet right on the ground?
Oh yeah, it is. It's the same. It's the same. I mean, obviously, there's some differences in that when you're outside grounding, you're also getting fresh air. You're also getting exposed to the natural microbiome of the environment. You're also getting the full spectrum sunlight. So there's lots of benefits to being outside and getting grounded outside of the grounding itself. But when electrically speaking, it's, yeah, identical.
Okay, and when it comes to light, you talked about a couple different bulb solutions, including incandescent bulbs. Because there is such a wide range of different light that comes from sun, the UVA, UVB, visible light, near infrared, far infrared, how close can we replicate that indoors? And what exactly would you use to get as close as possible?
Incandescent bulbs are like 80% infrared light, and it's full spectrum as well. So you can kind of think of, in the same way that when you like light a wick on a candle and you create fire, like most of that is infrared as well, and you can feel it as heat. You can kind of think of incandescent bulbs as a filament on fire. So you're also getting very full spectrum light in a continuous spectrum. And that's the other thing I really like to highlight as like a main difference also between LEDs, including red light panels and incandescent bulbs and sauna bulbs, for example, is that when you're using LEDs, you're getting targeted wavelengths. So when it comes to like bright white LEDs, we're getting a huge spike in blue and basically no red and infrared. A little bit of red, but no infrared. When we're talking about red light panels, typically red light panels will have about 4 wavelengths. They'll have a couple in the red and a couple in the near infrared. But when you're talking about something like a sauna space bulb or a sauna bulb in general or incandescent bulbs, you know, instead of just getting 620, 660, 810, and 850 in a red light panel, you're getting, you know, 620, 621, 622, all the way out to 3100 far infrared light. And so that continuous spectrum is much closer in its spectral composition to sunlight compared to something like an isolated LED. And there's other differences between LEDs as well, with like lensing effects and other like optics things that are like super nerdy and also a little bit out of my scope. I learn a lot from Scott Zimmerman though on this. He's like a big optics guy, studying the optics of the human body and sunlight and artificial light. It's really cool work. But yes, I would say the incandescent bulbs in general are going to be the closest you can get to natural light indoors. Of course, number one would be open up windows, but you still need to increase the brightness, right? Because if you're inside, it's still like a very shady environment. And if you measure the lux with something like the My Circadian app, you know, it's probably going to be a couple thousand lux if you're lucky. But like I mentioned, these chroma sky portals, although they are LEDs, they're designed to be no flicker. And they get up to 10,000 lux. So it's really nice. What I typically do is I'll have the sky portals on, and then I also have incandescent bulbs on in the overhead light fixture. So we're kind of getting both at the same time. And I also love my sauna bulbs as well. I also have a lizard bulb from healthlighting.com that's UVB, UVA, and then all the full spectrum as well. So during the winter time, I lean pretty heavily on that one just to help round out the indoor light environment and help with mood and things like this. A lot of people will reach for like SAD lamps for seasonal affective disorder. And most of those are complete like trash in my opinion, because they don't have any of the light that's actually going to help you feel good, which is UV light. UV light produces this complex prohormone in the body called pro-opiomelanocortin or POMC. POMC is cleaved into 10 different hormonal products, one of which is beta endorphin, which is a natural opioid that the body makes in response to UVB light in particular. So when UVB light interacts with the skin or the eyes, you make this POMC molecule and beta endorphin in the brain and in the skin. And so you're kind of, whenever you are exposed to full spectrum light, including UVB light, to your eyes and to your skin, you're getting the maximum possible expression of this beta endorphin, which not only improves mood, reduces anxiety, depression, but also improves overall dopamine status, critical thinking, reduces compulsive and addictive behaviors. And we can really think about a lot of the issues we see in the mental health space, let's say, in the modern day. as a result of beta endorphin deficiency, because we're not getting UVB light to make these opioid molecules, and also endocannabinoids are made in response to UV light as well in the body. We're not getting these natural impetuses for dopamine production that help us kind of cruise at altitude and feel good all day long. So instead, we have to get on the dopamine roller coaster, which is basically we're constantly looking for another hit of blue light, social media, junk food, alcohol, drugs, porn, whatever, somebody's like kind of vice of choices. All that is your body saying we need dopamine and we're not getting it from our environment, which means we need to go seek it out. Like, you're going to have to get it one way or the other. The healthy way to get it is if you're, in full spectrum sunlight and getting UV light. That's going to allow you to have much more autonomy and sovereignty over your decision making versus this feeling of compulsion to kind of just seek out whatever is going to get you that next hit, which is the roller coaster that most people are on. And so when I think about, mental health issues, but also the metabolic and obesity crisis as well, another cleavage product of POMC is alpha MSH, or melanocyte stimulating hormone. As the name implies, alpha MSH helps to stimulate melanocytes to make new melanin, which is what gives you a tan in response to UV light. But in addition, alpha MSH also works in the hypothalamus to decrease appetite and increase energy expenditure. And when we're thinking about body composition and obesity, this is really, you can think about obesity as an inflammatory brain disease / an aberration in your environment that is creating this outcome, because the brain is no longer saying, instead of essentially saying we need to eat less and we can burn more because we're safe and like we're good, we've got plenty of energy on board. Instead, it's saying the opposite. It's saying we need to, hoard and gorge on food and shut down our metabolism because we're in a scarcity state. And this directly relates to the leptin-melanocortin pathway. So leptin is the energy accountant of the body. You can think of it as actually an accountant for electrons. Leptin is made in the subcutaneous fat, and it's essentially a readout of how many electrons the body has stored to use for future energy production. And so in leptin resistance, which is the process by which leptin is still made from the subcutaneous fat, but there is something broken in the relay that tells the brain how much leptin is present. So basically, the leptin receptor might be sensing the amount of leptin that's there, but the signal gets shut off at some point along the way, so that the deeper parts of the brain, like in the hypothalamus, it thinks that the body is starving because it's sensing virtually no leptin, because that signaling cascade is broken. And if leptin levels are super low, that's a sign that you're basically starving to death. And so it's like, we need to eat more and we need to shut down metabolism because it's not safe. We can really think about leptin and leptin sensitivity and signaling and this POMC cascade as the body trying to determine whether or not it's in a state of abundance or scarcity. And so when it comes to the leptin-melanocortin pathway, the melanocortin part of that pathway directly refers to this alpha MSH system, because the receptors in the brain that alpha MSH binds to are the melanocortin receptors. And so when leptin in a healthy body, when leptin binds to those receptors, it stimulates the production of POMC in the hypothalamus to allow energy expenditure to go up and food intake to go down. UV light does the same exact thing through the eyes. So when you get UV light through the eyes, it signals the production of POMC, which allows, in the hypothalamus, the appetite to go down and energy expenditure to go up. This is also the same pathway that Ozempic works on. So Ozempic, the GLP-1 agonist, stimulates the production of POMC in the central nervous system, which allows, again, appetite to go down, energy expenditure to go up. So when I think about this like craze over Ozempic, it's very obvious to me that we are highly deficient in UV light societally, which, shouldn't be a surprise, because most people are walking around with sunglasses, contacts, or prescription glasses, all of which block UV light into the eye. And so we're missing that piece that's coming in to tell the brain to make this POMC molecule. So it's not necessarily, it's better than nothing to just get UV light on your skin as much as possible, to be honest, and we can talk about why. But we're really meant to get the coordinated exposure of UV light into our eyes and onto our skin to get the optimal physiological and metabolic response. And this problem's only getting worse as well. And I think the myopia rates, so nearsightedness rates, are predicted to be around 50% worldwide by the year 2050. Which means that 50% of the population is going to be walking around with UV blocking lenses covering their eyes. And there are some solutions there, like the Dailies Total One contacts are the ones that I wear when I wear my contacts, and those do not have added UV blocking. You can also get CR39 lenses within your glasses. They do not block UV light. They block about 40%, but they allow about 60% through. You have to just make sure you don't get a coating added to that, and some eye doctors will push back, some won't. You might have to shop around a little bit. But those are two kind of compromises that you can make if you want to get, some of that good light into your eyes. And of course, if in a perfect world, like whenever you're getting intentional sun exposure, just try to pop your glasses off or your contacts out so that you're getting that full spectrum natural light, just the ambient light into your eyes. Obviously, don't go out and stare at the sun. You don't need to do that. Just getting the ambient photons into your eyes is enough to get that positive endocrine response, let's say. So yeah, I'm sure you have questions now. I've been rambling a while.
Well, let's stick on the indoor part. Best would be to be outdoors, obviously, getting natural light. Second best, you'd have your window cracked open a bit, even if there's a screen there. When it comes to bulbs, you've talked about incandescent. What parts of the spectrum do they have? I just want to make sure somebody in their indoor environment can account for the different aspects of sunlight to try and recreate that best they can.
Standard incandescent bulbs have a little bit of UVA and then a ton of infrared all the way out through far infrared. If you wanted to get more of the UV component, you need to look at like the lizard basking bulbs, the reptile basking bulbs. That's what they're made for, because for whatever reason, there's an acknowledgement that these creatures need UV light, but there's like this taboo around UV light in humans. It's just very paradoxical. But anyways, yeah, those would be the bulbs you would want to get if you want to enhance the UV component. And then in the wintertime, you can use things like Spurdy panels. So Spurdy makes a vitamin D light as well as their Fiji sun lamp. So the vitamin D light is about 80% UVB, 20% UVA. The Fiji sun lamp is about 80% UVA, 20% UVB. Depending on somebody's goals. So if somebody has like fat loss or mental health goals, I would go for the UVB dominant lamp. It's going to have more bang for your buck in a shorter period of time because of that POMC component. For people who have cardiovascular health issues, I recommend the UVA dominant lamp because, as it turns out, UVA light is a primary stimulus of nitric oxide in the body. So when UVA light interacts with the skin, it stimulates the production of nitric oxide in the skin, which then diffuses into the bloodstream. And for those people who don't know, nitric oxide is the major factor that allows for vasodilation, so blood vessel dilation, which allows for nutrient and oxygen delivery to tissues, waste removal from tissues, and also lowering blood pressure. Deficits in nitric oxide production are a primary cause of hypertension and cardiovascular disease. And this is largely because people are not getting their skin in the game, as Jack would say. So the more skin you have exposed to natural light, the more nitric oxide you produce, because again, it's made in the skin. So we need to expose as much skin as possible when we're trying to leverage these benefits. And also like just within like, let's say the gym bro community as well, people are often taking like nitric oxide boosters, but not realizing that the light in your environment is the primary stimulus to dictate how much nitric oxide you're actually making. So if you really want to get a good pump, you should be lifting outside in your yard barefoot in the sun with like no shirt, like little as clothes as possible. Like that's like the best approach. And that's what I do as well. I have a home gym in my garage, but we bring our weights out into the yard. And that's a great way to get, the biggest bang for your buck for your workout as well, because then you're not only getting the nitric oxide pump, but you're also getting the red and infrared support of mitochondria. You're also getting the UVB part of the component with the endorphin production, which improves pain tolerance, which means you can get probably a couple extra reps in as well. You're grounding at the same time, so that's going to help provide a healthy balance of electrons to protons in the system. So it's kind of a perfect setup if you can do that. But yeah, to go back to your question, so those would be some options to help enhance the UV light component in the environment. The reptile basking bulbs would be like for continuous use. The Spurdy lamps would be like for pulsed use for like a few minutes a day or something like this. And I typically recommend, if you're going to do the Spurdy, either use it outside with natural light so you get the red and infrared added in, because we're always meant to receive them together. Or you can use it with like a sauna space bulb, a sauna bulb, or even a red light panel just to help add back some of the red and near infrared with the UV, because they have a very synergistic effect when applied together.
So when you're talking about the sauna bulb, I assume you can do that within a sauna. far or near infrared sauna, depending on what you're trying to get. But it sounds like you can get that bulb separately and just have it in your room.
Yeah, so Sauna Space makes one. Healthlighting.com also has one. If you just search like red in their search bar, you can get, they have like a red light therapy bulb, but it's an incandescent bulb. Same with the Sauna Space. So it makes red all the way out through far infrared light. So I really like that. Also, the animals love it as well. Like I usually keep ours on all day and the cat just kind of like melts under the light for usually like 45 minutes, and then she'll take a break for 15 minutes, and then she'll go back. And I think we can learn a lot from watching animals too, right? Because most of them, if they have access to sunlight, they're always going into the light and then they're pulsing in some shade time. And that's what we're meant to do as humans as well. Like shade is nature's sunscreen. Leveraging that as needed is a great way to prevent burning, and also just kind of tapping into your body's intuition. If you feel like you're getting overheated, super hot, or you're starting to get tender on your skin, you move into the shade. It doesn't mean you have to douse yourself in chemicals. And I mean, we can talk about the innate harms of sunscreen versus like some of the chemical harms of sunscreen as well, maybe at some point. But yeah, the sauna bulbs are a great thing to have around. They are high wattage though, so you just want to make sure that you get the right fixture for them. So you either want to get a reptile lamp fixture, which is rated up to something like 250 or 260 watts, or I know Health Lighting sells their bulb in a lamp already, so that's like also an easy way to get it.
And how do you feel about these panels? The full body panels, there's handheld ones, there's face masks, ones you can put on your scalp. When it comes to red and infrared light,
there's definitely a time and place for them. They're definitely better than nothing at all when it comes to red and infrared, and we're really meant to receive red and infrared light all day long as the sun is up. So they're not the best way to add red and infrared back into your like ambient environment, because most of them have a timer, first of all. But the best way to do that is really to leverage like bulbs of some sort, just to have on in the background. But for targeted therapy of injury sites or during a workout or something like this, there can definitely be some utility to using them. But yeah, they got a time and place, but they're limited in their spectrum, like I mentioned earlier. So it's not a replacement, but it can be used as a tool for sure.
and when it comes to brands, it seems like more and more companies are jumping on and creating these panels. Is there certain brands that you would lean into?
Yeah, so actually, Mito is the brand that we've used for almost 3 years now. And I sit on their scientific board now. So that's a brand that I've tested. They're low EMF, they're no flicker, they work well from my experience. I also like the brand Solewell, made by Kelly Bento. She basically tested a bunch of red light panels on the market. She didn't know about Mito at the time, but all the other popular ones, Mito was pretty small at the time, but basically they were all high EMF. They had issues with flicker. Like, she couldn't find one that was really good, so she decided to make her own. And she works with like some professional athletes as well now, and some teams up in the Boston area. But her panels are also wonderful. So Mito and Solewell are like my two favorites.
You've talked about flicker now a couple times. Let's talk about where somebody would find that and why it's problematic.
Yeah, so flicker is an issue with LEDs and fluorescent bulbs. LEDs, if we're talking about devices like screens, but also LED bulbs as well as fluorescent bulbs. So essentially what flicker is, it's like a strobing effect. And oftentimes we can't see it with the naked eye, though some people can. Like, I'm actually pretty sensitive to flicker in the sense that, like, if there's a bulb that's flickering, I can almost always see it. And you can confirm that by, taking out your phone and filming it on slow motion mode. And then you can see like a lot of these lights, if you're going into mainstream grocery stores and, malls and things like this, the lights are going crazy. It's like a strobe light show. And although you can't necessarily detect it at like a baseline with your eyeballs, your brain does detect it, and your eyes are sensing it in the fact that it does make your pupils rapidly expand and contract, and it can be very exhausting to the muscles that control that. And it can also trigger headaches, migraines. It activates the sympathetic nervous system, so it can create a low-grade stress response. And a lot of people are sitting under these strobing lights all the time, where they're sitting on screens that are high in this strobing effect, which means that you're basically just stressing out your body. And of course, that's compounded with the fact that these light sources are also enriched in blue light in isolation. which has an additive effect of this sympathetic driving the sympathetic response. So it's kind of just like a perfect storm of like exposures you don't want to have your body have if you're looking to have a regulated nervous system, and also healthy digestion and things like this too, because that of course requires a good parasympathetic to sympathetic balance. So when it comes to recovery, digestion, tissue repair, sleep, like all of this requires us to be able to get parasympathetic. And if we're constantly exposed to these types of devices and flicker and artificial blue light, non-native EMFs, then we're setting ourselves up to have huge issues in these departments.
And when it comes to flicker at home, what are the different areas we want to look to? I know computer, different handheld devices, cell phones. What about TVs? Yeah. Obviously LED bulbs, if somebody still has those throughout the house.
Yeah, TVs are a huge problem. So what I would recommend for people is if you're going shopping for a new TV, just like put your phone on slow-mo mode and like just test all the ones on the wall. You'll see some are absolutely awful, and some may be a little bit less awful. So basically anything that's plugged directly into the power grid may have this issue, because they see your alternating current power grid basically has fluctuations in the power that is being sent to the device. So that can exacerbate flicker from, LEDs and these types of devices. So computer monitors of like desktop computers, cell phones are really bad despite the fact that they are battery powered. Because they shifted to something called pulse width modulation instead of using DC dimming. So the last iPhone model that was copacetic with regards to flicker was the iPhone 11. And everything since then has used this PWM, which basically means that if you try to dim the screen, instead of just reducing the power being sent to each pixel, it just like changes the intensity of the spike that is sent to each pixel instead. So instead, you're basically just getting this massive flicker output. And I think it's actually even if you have the screen on max brightness, it's still quite bad. And so most cell phones are like that. There is a list, like there's a whole community of flicker sensitive people online. So there's like some forums online on Reddit and places like this, and they've like tested different models. And so if that's something that somebody's concerned in, they can kind of look online and see the phones that are, less bad in this department. But, I think I've talked to Tristan Scott from Daylight Computer quite a bit, and Daylight Computer's flicker free and blue light free. A computer basically, it has a very high refresh rate, even though it uses an e-ink platform, which usually has a pretty crappy refresh rate. So they've really engineered that very nicely, and they're planning to make a computer monitor next. But we were talking about phones, and like a lot of people were asking, like, can you guys make a phone? And he was just saying, like, they really want to think about it carefully, because the form factor of phones in and of itself is like problematic, right? Because it's small enough that you can carry it with you everywhere you go. Like your level of distraction with a phone is much higher than with like an actual desktop computer, or something that is just a little less convenient, let's say. So they want to think about a way to do it the way he described phones is like actually being demonic, because they have this ability to hijack your attention essentially no matter what. So anyway, I think phones are just problematic in and of themselves, outside of the blue light, the non-native EMFs, the flicker, but there are definitely some that are better than others.
Okay, so it sounds like phones, no perfect solution. TVs, no perfect solution. I know with computers, my laptop, I have a program called Iris on there that I use for the blue light, but it also supposedly has an anti-flicker. I don't know how good that is. Do you know a lot about it?
I heard that Flux is a bit better than Iris for the flicker removal. I don't have a device that tests with like any level of precision yet, so I would like to at some point test that. But yeah, for the blue light standpoint, Flux and Iris work really well. You can use that on laptops and desktop computers. On your phone, if you have an iPhone, you can use the native settings and turn the phone amber or red. So I keep mine on amber all day long. For TVs, some TVs, depending on the brand, have advanced settings. So like on our TVs, I'll go into the advanced settings and put on RGB mode. So if we're going to be watching at night, I just make the screen red. The Second best thing would be just to reduce the brightness as much as you can if you're going to watch at night, and then maybe add in some red bulbs in the environment to just help counterbalance some of the blue. Or, of course, you can pop on blue blocking glasses, but it's an imperfect solution because our skin also contains photoreceptors that are sensing the light environment. So just blocking blue light into the eyes, isn't ideal. It's still better than nothing, but yeah, if you can cover your skin as well or just optimize the light and tune the light in your environment, that's going to be a better solution versus just blocking the light coming into the eyes.
It sounds like it, but you can clarify the three different things we're looking at nullifying or blocking at night: blue light, brightness of light, and flicker. Would that be it?
Yeah, I would say that's a fair assessment. Yeah, the blue light is going to directly impair melatonin release from the pineal gland, so we don't want that to happen because we want to have good recovery and get into good sleep. The bright light will also impair melatonin release as well, and the flicker is going to just create this low-grade sympathetic response. So that's not what we're looking for in the evening. So yeah, I would say that's a pretty good list.
Talk more about the light impacting the skin at night, because I'm almost sure, and I've probably been in this boat at times as well, where when you put on the blue light blocking glasses, you feel like you're immune to all the negative effects of blue light.
Yeah.
So talk about the skin and what we can do to mitigate that.
Yeah, so the light coming into the eyes is what's controlling that melatonin, rise or suppression. So it is important to make sure that we are at least blocking blue light coming into the eyes if there's blue light in the environment. However, as I mentioned earlier, the blue light in the environment can also directly impair skin mitochondrial function. So that's kind of independent of the light receptor, the photoreceptor action. But our skin is also full of melanopsin, which is this blue light detector, and it remains to be seen exactly what's happening in these non-visual photoreceptor relays, like what the signaling cascade is exactly. But what I will say is that, it's probably ideal to coordinate an environment to your eyes and skin that's the same so that you're not sending conflicting signals to each. And trying to create an environment that is most conducive to that seems like a fair approach. And it's also not super expensive, and it's pretty easy to do with regards to, getting some maybe red incandescent bulbs for your home at night, or red bulbs in general would be better than, using a white bulb. And reducing your tech use, at night as well. I think it's, a lot of people are addicted to this stuff, but part of actually getting out into the sun more and getting into nature more is realizing that you don't really need to be on, socials and on, your devices all the time. It actually feels way better to be off of them. So I think that comes with time. As you start improving your lifestyle and your environment, you're going to feel less of a compulsion to be on these things all the time.
Earlier you mentioned building an outside work area for people that work at home, and that being likely a better investment than supplements. Let's talk about what your outdoor work environment looks like. You're indoors today, you mentioned the rain, but for somebody that wants to take this on, order a few different things to enhance that experience, because it can be very challenging to see a screen working outside. What have you found are the biggest needle movers in that realm?
Yeah, so really all you need is something to provide a level of shade that you can put your computer in so that you don't have so much glare, and better contrast. So, for me, I just have like a simple patio table and an umbrella that I put up when I'm working out there. And then I have the umbrella oriented so that the table is shaded, but where I'm sitting is not. So I'm able to sit in the sun while the computer's in the shade. I'll also, during the summertime, if it's super hot out, I'll often times take it like this, like a big flat ice pack, and then put some paper towels over it, and then put my computer on top of it, just so the computer doesn't overheat as well. So yeah, other than that, like, it doesn't have to be much more fancy than that. Of course, I also have like lounge chairs outside so I can take breaks and like laying in the sun. I also have the patio table situated so that I can have one foot on my patio / on the grass so that I can also be grounding while I'm out there. And if somebody can't configure their setup like that, you can always get a grounding mat and then just run the line to plug it into the earth so that you can, use the grounding mat in lieu of direct connection to the grass or pavement. I will mention that most patios, I won't say most actually. It depends. If your patio has a plastic liner underneath it, it's going to block the grounding force. If it doesn't, then it won't. So it kind of just depends. Again, you can test that. Otherwise, grass will be grounding, stone will be grounding, sand, dirt, all of those are fair game. So yeah, that's basically, all I've got out there. It's nothing fancy, but it really gets the job done. It doesn't really take that much money to make that happen, depending on, what somebody's working with outside. If somebody has a screened in porch, they, of course can work on that as well, because then you're going to be getting the natural light coming in. So depending on what somebody's got going on, there are some options.
For somebody working on a porch or a deck made of wood, is that grounded?
It's going to depend what the wood is connected to. I mean, I always say just test, don't guess. So you test it, and if it's not, you can, rig something so that you can have a grounding mat on there. And if it is, then you're going to be good to go.
You mentioned the fact that when you're working outside, you will angle your umbrella and work in a way where your body is still in the sun.
Mm-hmm.
When you've been in the sun for a long enough period of time, well, actually, for somebody that, say, hasn't built a solar callus and they need to stay in the shade, or for whatever reason, they're just working under the shade,
Mm-hmm.
how much of the benefit do they get in that environment versus being directly in the sun?
You're still getting a ton of benefit. You still get a ton of reflected near-infrared light by being outside in the shade. So that is the most penetrative of the light frequencies, which means that it can get really deep into your body and support your mitochondria, even in the deepest parts of your body. It can go through bone, it can go through clothes. So near-infrared light is a really, really important feature of being outside that is blocked if you're indoors. And so you're going to get that benefit whether you're in direct sun or in the shade. And of course, you might be getting some grounding as well. You're going to be getting some fresh air and exposure to the natural microbes in the environment. So there's lots of benefits to being outside in the shade. For me personally, I'm at 40 north latitude, so I'm like in central Jersey, and I'm mixed, so like I have more melanin naturally, so I can handle a lot of sun. I will literally be out like this time of year in direct sun for 8 hours, and like I'm not burning or anything like this. But there's also a lot of lifestyle factors that influence whether or not somebody might burn. It's not just simply, that you're pale. It's like, what else are you doing in your life that is increasing your susceptibility to burning, whether it's related to your diet, your light exposure habits, your eating timing, whether it's related to your use of sunglasses and UV blocking contacts and lenses that's preventing that light from getting into the eye. There's lots of different factors that can influence how susceptible you are for burning, and maybe, we could talk about those a little bit if you want.
Yeah, let's go into them. You mentioned diet. Let's start there.
Yeah, so one of the major ones is the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. So omega-3 fats are highly anti-inflammatory and supportive to the body. Omega-6 fats are also essential fatty acids, but we're basically overdosing on them in the modern environment. So if you look at the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 in the ancestral diet compared to today, we're looking at like a 2 or 4 to 1 ratio of 6 to 3 in the past and around a 20 to 1 ratio today. So we're eating way more sixes than we ever have before, and that's primarily from hyperpalatable processed foods that use industrially produced seed oils to, fry and cook them in. So that would include things like soy, corn, sunflower, safflower oils that are highly enriched in omega-6 fats, which there's an added issue with the omega-6s, which are also a type of polyunsaturated fat, a PUFA. So are the omega-3s, but PUFAs are very fragile because they have multiple double bonds. They have points where they're susceptible to oxidation, essentially, and getting rancid. And so most industrial seed oils, to my knowledge, are deodorized to prevent you from detecting whether or not they're actually rancid with your nose. Because, typically if something was rancid, you would know it immediately. You wouldn't want to eat it. And so there's like all of these hoops that the companies jump through to make this product seem palatable when it's actually very poisonous. And the fats that you're eating in your diet are directly influencing your skin cell membranes because the skin turns over roughly every 8 days, I believe. And so the fat in your diet is influencing the fats that end up in those skin cell membranes. So if you have these fragile, oxidized PUFAs in your membranes compared to something like an animal-based saturated fat, for example, which has no double bonds and has this nice straight structure that allows it to stack on top of each other nicely. The PUFAs have these large kinks in the structure that prevent them from sitting nicely. So if you have cell membranes that are chock full of these omega-6s that are also oxidized on top of that, they're reactive, they're inflamed, they're changing the membrane fluidity of skin cells to make the skin cells more fragile. And so you're going to have already like a low-grade chronic inflammation in the skin potentially, which makes your skin more susceptible to burning when you're exposed to UV light. That's coupled with the fact that people are highly deficient in omega-3s. So the omega-3s are highly anti-inflammatory, like I mentioned, especially omega-3 DHA. Most people aren't getting virtually any EPA or DHA in the diet. Most people are only getting alpha-linoleic acid or ALA, which is the plant-based form of omega-3s. The conversion of ALA to EPA is between 5 and 10%, and the conversion of ALA to DHA is between 0.5 and 4%. And so it's feasibly, impossible to make enough DHA from getting ALA alone. You need to get EPA and DHA from animal-based sources, so that would be shellfish, caviar, fatty fish. Lamb is one land animal that's highest in DHA as well. And so a lot of people aren't necessarily eating foods like this to get those animal-based omega-3s in. And some people, if they're like vegetarian and not eating seafood, or they're vegan, relying on algal oils, there's another added issue here as well, because just to get a little technical briefly, if you look at the structure of the fats in algal oil and in animal-based sources of omega-3s, they're primarily triglycerides. The one exception is caviar, which is primarily the phospholipid form of omega-3s, which is actually the most bioavailable to the brain and the eyes. The retina is about 65% by weight DHA, and the brain is about 35% by weight DHA. So these tissues rely on DHA in order to function. And there's a researcher called Dr. Michael Crawford who actually works, he's like a major DHA researcher, and he has shown that DHA actually works at the quantum biologic level to convert photonic or light information into electrical impulses, which allows you to render reality from moment to moment. So the DHA in your eyes and your brain is actually what is allowing you to have an experience of the world. So it's very, very important. But if we're looking at the triglyceride form in algal oil or in fish or shellfish, triglycerides are made of a glycerol backbone, which has 3 carbons, and on each carbon you can have, technically at each oxygen that's bound to each carbon, you can have a fatty acid. So there's 3 fatty acids on the glycerol backbone. The first one is SN1, middle one is SN2, the last one is SN3. So in algal oil, you have primarily SN1 and SN3 EPA and DHA. In fatty fish and shellfish, you primarily have the SN2 position. It turns out that the SN2 position is highly more bioavailable for humans than the SN1 and SN3 positions. So if you're looking to optimize your EPA and DHA status, it is very prudent to get animal-based sources of these fats, as they're just going to, be a better bang for your buck and also support your biology better. Of course, there's lots of other nutrients that come along for the ride when it comes to the shellfish and the fatty fish, like mackerel, sardines, herring, salmon, ideally wild caught whenever you can. Of course, the diet of the fish in question will greatly influence the fat composition. So if you're eating farmed salmon, you're not really going to be getting any omega-3s because those salmon are fed corn, which is enriched in omega-6s. What allows the fish that you're eating for omega-3s to actually get that EPA and DHA is either they're consuming algae or they're consuming another animal that consumed algae. The algae is ultimately the initial source of the omegas, but by consuming them, these other animals can convert them into the more bioavailable form that supports our bodies better. So on the dietary standpoint, that's one of the major ones, I would say, this omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. But there's also an issue of timing as well. So there's some research to suggest that if you eat late at night, you're more susceptible to burning the next day. And that's because the gut, the skin, and the lungs are all very inextricably linked. They're all barrier surfaces. And so it turns out when you eat late at night, it messes with your gut clocks that are trying to determine what time of day it is depending on when you're eating. So if you're eating a meal and it's, nighttime, it's, let's say, I don't know, 10 p.m. or something like this, you're telling your gut that it's daytime, actually. And that's informing your skin that, oh crap, it's actually daytime, not nighttime, so we got to change some things around. And now when it's actually daytime, your skin is like, I don't know what time it is anymore. So like now it's not able to mount the melanation response in the same way and support the assimilation of that photonic energy as well, compared to somebody who has a more circadian way of eating, which would be a larger breakfast meal. You can maybe even skip lunch if you wanted, and then having a smaller, more keto or carnivore dinner, which would allow you to get into a good fat burning state overnight so that when you wake up around sunrise, you're combining low-grade ketosis with red and infrared light from the sun, in particular ratio with blue, which optimizes mitophagy, autophagy, and cellular turnover. Also helps to repair all the heme proteins in the body, including hemoglobin, including the protein complexes that are involved in that electron transport chain within the mitochondria, as well as setting that circadian clock in the brain, that master clock. So the timing of your food is also important in this context to help prevent burning. And I mean, outside of that, I guess the one other thing that I would mention is like just your glycemic response to meals, because if you're consistently getting hyperglycemic after meals and it takes a while to clear that glucose, that's both kind of a sign and symptom of mitochondrial dysfunction. So like it can both exacerbate inflammation and make issues worse, but it can also, it's basically a sign that there's already an underlying issue present at the level of like insulin resistance, for example, which is typically preceded by leptin resistance as well. So they tend to go together. So maintaining like more stable glycemia levels are imperative, and I would say supportive if you're looking to maintain a lower inflammatory state. And the lower our baseline of inflammation is, the less likely we're going to be to burn as well. So I think those are probably the main diet pieces. With regards to the light environment pieces, if we're looking at the light coming into the eyes, again, I told you guys earlier that when you get UV light into the eye, it stimulates POMC production in the brain. That makes alpha MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone, but also beta and gamma MSH as well. This trio helps to stimulate melanocytes to make new melanin. So if you want to get a tan in response to the sun and not a burn, it's important that we're getting that coordinated production of the MSHs in both the brain and in the skin in order to maximize that melanation response. If you're blocking half of that equation, then you're going to be basically missing half of the response. And so, I would say there's typically pushback from the more centralized zealots out there about, there's no evidence that sunglasses block your, or like increase your susceptibility to burning. But mechanistically, from a first principle standpoint, it's very there. It's just that like people don't study these types of questions because the sun is just demonized point blank. There's no nuance to be had there. Despite the fact that if you look at the risk benefit of sun exposure, even within the centralized literature, you'll see in certain cases, which I would argue are completely preventable with regards to squamous cell, basal cell, and melanoma. Actually, there's some evidence to suggest that melanoma is not caused by skin or by sun exposure at all, but that basal cell and squamous cell, there may be a small contribution, but that if somebody's building out their solar callus, this may not be an issue whatsoever. We don't have enough nuance in that published data to say that, but that's my hypothesis and what I would also plan to study within the light lab in the future. But when it comes to, the risk side of the equation, there's always this, citing of skin cancer or eye damage. Meanwhile, if you actually look at the big picture of the literature, we see, okay, there may be a small increased risk of basal cell carcinoma. But if you look at the benefit side of the equation, we have protection against cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, multiple cancer types, including melanoma, but also including breast cancer, colon cancer, prostate cancer, and blood cancers. We also have protection against neurodegeneration and autoimmune diseases. So if we look at the total burden on our healthcare system, clearly the risk benefit is much weighted towards the benefit of getting more sun exposure and not the risks, given that the benefits are supporting the amelioration or the prevention of diseases that are the biggest burdens on our healthcare system. And so I just think that the lack of nuance in that conversation is always a big red flag to me when we see anything just demonized point blank and there's no sort of consideration for, more context to the conversation. And then, of course, there's also just a complete lack of like contextualization for people of different races. So, like, to the point where there's literally a brand of sunscreen on the market called Black Girl Sunscreen. And I'm just like pulling my hair out because sunscreen is the last thing somebody with dark skin needs, especially if you live in America, because essentially anybody with more melanated skin that lives in America is at too north of a latitude for their biology. Like, we should be at more southern latitudes because our skin is expecting to receive that full spectrum light. That's the point of that melanin. And like some in the centralized sphere would argue, okay, melanin is there to protect against UV light. But I would actually make the argument that the melanin is there to harness the high photonic energy of the UV light productively. And that is kind of in alignment with the work of Dr. Arturo Solis Herrera, who has coined this term human photosynthesis, whereby melanin can be used to make free energy in the body via sunlight stimulating that melanin. And that has already been proven unequivocally within a different model system of mushrooms. So there were mushrooms found in Chernobyl in the 90s that were like dark black in color. And the research team found out that these mushrooms were actually using melanin to make free energy from the gamma radiation from the nuclear fallout in the environment. So we already know this is possible within mushrooms, which are actually more closely related to animals than they are to plants. So we just basically need to, get a little bit more funding for this research. There's not that much available within the centralized model, but that's why I'm also going to build out this light lab, which is going to be fully privately funded and decentralized, so that we don't have these same hurdles of like getting funding from the three-letter agencies to ask important questions that are not prioritized by the, powers that be that are embedded within this pharmaceutical, medical, industrial complex. And there's no incentive to really ask these questions and prevent people from getting diseases that are being financially leveraged in some way. So anyway, I forgot what I was initially talking about. I think sunburn
in different foods ways of eating that can impact that.
There's a couple other things I'll mention before I'll hand the mic back. So the other thing I already mentioned was blue light exposure, because it directly impairs mitochondrial function in the skin and on your surfaces in general. Mitochondria are required to make new melanin. And so if you're impairing the mitochondria, that's going to impair your ability to make new melanin in response to UVB light. In addition, non-native EMFs similarly also directly impair mitochondrial function on the surfaces, the skin, eyes, and proximal brain regions. And so that is also going to impair the melanation response to UVB light. And I think those are kind of the main ones that I'm thinking about right now. Something else will probably come to me, but I'm sure you have questions.
Let me know if it does. Let's come back to the skin color and talk about somebody based on their skin color, how light hygiene may change. And you mentioned somebody with darker skin would be better off at, a more tropical area getting more sunlight. But what if they are, due to family, due to a job, forced to live up north? What can they do to hack that?
Melanin is a sponge for light. Melanin is actually really interesting, and it's going to be one of the major pillars in my lab that we're going to be focusing on, because not only is it this pigment that absorbs all wavelengths of light from radio frequencies, aka non-native EMFs, all the way up through gamma radiation. It is a major protective mechanism against radiation in general. If we're thinking about, protecting our organs and tissues from the effects of non-native EMFs or radon or whatever other kind of gamma radiation we might be exposed to, building your melanin, building your solar callus is a great way to buffer your body against these exposures. But in addition to that, melanin is also a potent heavy metal chelator, so it can pull heavy metals out of the bloodstream and protect your tissues against damage from these heavy metals as well. Like I mentioned, melanin is likely also to play a role in the bioenergetics of the system. So if somebody is born and naturally has more melanin in their skin, it really should be seen as a blessing and as a superpower. Meanwhile, there's like this just crazy colonial mindset that is embedded within science and medicine and culture, frankly, throughout the Western world, but also within Latin America as well. I have so many friends and clients who have family in Latin America who don't want to get a tan because it's seen as being a lower class in their society. And it's just like this archaic colonial mindset where like the colonialism basically says that like, light skin is, superior in some way and that darker skin is bad or dirty or something. And it's like, Actually, that is propaganda that is geared towards disempowering the population. Meanwhile, melanin is this, incredible molecule that supports health in so many different ways. So if you naturally are gifted with more melanin, the consideration that I like to bring up first and foremost is like, if we look at vitamin D as a biomarker, so, kind of just as a brief tangent, vitamin D is something a lot of people supplement with, and they think that they're doing something good. But all of the big trials, like the VITAL study, which was a massive study on vitamin D supplementation and health outcomes, showed no benefit to supplementing with vitamin D on any chronic disease states, cancers, diabetes. I think were a couple of the major outcomes they were looking at. Despite the fact that vitamin D deficiency is highly associated with the incidence and severity of multiple different disease states. So the main takeaway from that, for me, is that vitamin D is a biomarker of your time spent outdoors and not necessarily this marker that you should supplement for to optimize. There will be some exceptions, like if people have overt rickets, like let's say sub 12 nanograms per milliliter, they'll probably get a benefit from supplementing in the short term to help bolster their levels and at least protect their bones and teeth from decalcification and, the issues that can happen therein. However, for people who are like 20 nanograms per mil roughly or above, that is not a range that we're looking to supplement. That's a range we're looking to optimize our sun exposure habits to get that into the optimal range, which is between 60 and 80 nanograms per milliliter. That is a range that would suggest that you're getting enough sunlight exposure for your body. And that already accounts for melanation. Because melanin is a sponge for light, the more melanin you have, the more that light gets sequestered away and the less light there is available to make that conversion of 7-dehydrocholesterol into pre-vitamin D. And so what that means is your vitamin D status as somebody with more melanin is a sign if you're getting enough UVB light for you. And so if you are highly deficient and you're still getting a lot of sun, if you're at a more northern latitude, the sun quality is just quite poor for basically half the year relative to where your ancestors would have come from in a more equatorial region. So in those cases, if people can't be like a snowbird and go to another, more equatorial place for a part of the year, you can leverage something like the vitamin D lamp from Spurdy, for example, to help give your body some of that stimulus that it's looking for while still staying at your more northern latitude. The other thing that I will mention there as well is that nature doesn't make mistakes, and in the wintertime when UV light is low and days are short, we're meant to get cold because the cold is what allows the mitochondria to be stimulated to make more of their own infrared and UV photons. And so it's kind of this perfect balance when UV and infrared light are low in the environment because it's wintertime. The cold helps the body compensate for that lack of outside-in UV and infrared light and make its own. And so there is, let's say a hypothesis out there that I actually want to test in the lab as well, that perhaps cold could either change the expression of vitamin D binding protein to help vitamin D stay more stable in the circulation in the wintertime, or perhaps even some of the UV photons made in the mitochondria could actually escape into the greater cellular environment and actually convert some of that 7-dehydrocholesterol into vitamin D. We don't know that, but it's certainly feasible given that the light that our mitochondria is making is actually stronger than that produced by the sun. It's actually in the UVC range, these biophotons, not even in the UVB range. UVC light doesn't make it through the atmosphere. It gets, absorbed or scattered. So this is like very high energy photons that are being produced within the cell, within the mitochondria. And furthermore, because the scale is so small and the proximity is so close, the intensity of these photons is very high. So there's something called the inverse square law, which is also relevant to the non-native EMF story, which states that the closer you are to a source of EMFs, the higher the intensity. So what that means for non-native EMFs is that if you're right next to a Wi-Fi router, it's worse than if you were across the house from a Wi-Fi router. Or if you have your cell phone in your pocket, it's worse than if it was on the table in front of you or your laptop on your lap, etc. You want to always try to put some distance between you and the source of non-native EMFs. On the flip side, when it comes to biophotons, because we're talking about the atto and the femto level, like very, very, very small scales within cells, these photons are going to have very strong effects because the source of the creation of these photons is right next to, in proximity to, things that it might be acting on. So I think there's a ton that we can learn there with regards to the potential effects on vitamin D, pharmacodynamics in the bloodstream, and also other actions that those biophotons could be having within the system. But suffice to say for now that I think if you're somebody with darker skin or more equatorial mitochondria, like a more coupled mitochondrial haplotype, which comes from equatorial regions, you'll still likely benefit from getting cold in the wintertime or just cold in general to help your body assimilate to that environment a bit more readily. And people with uncoupled mitochondria, so my dad's side of the family is black, my mom's side is white, so my mitochondria came from my mom, and my mom's mitochondria came from Scandinavia, so I have Viking mitochondria, but I have like medium, I would say like Fitzpatrick foreskin right now. And so my mitochondria are actually expecting to receive cold for a period of the year, and so I, lean into that quite a bit because I'm in New Jersey, so we do have seasons. And so I do a lot of cold plunging during the summer as well. Mostly like cold walks during the winter time. But cold is a great way to help compensate for poor light in the environment is basically the punchline of what I was trying to say.
Got it. So it can be looked at almost like a backup for us up in the north in the wintertime when we're getting less light.
Yep. And in general as well, like if you're somebody who, let's say certain days of the week, that you're gonna not be able to get outside for midday sun, for example, or at all even, like for more than a few minutes, you could leverage cold in some way to help buffer your body against that.
So when it comes to melanin, a few minutes back you went deeper into it, but it sounds like at least two of the roles then, as we build our solar callus, the melanin is going to help us protect from the sun in the future. And then also you mentioned it can be used for energy creation. Can you talk more about the latter?
Yeah, so I mean, this is the hypothesis that Dr. Herrera has proposed that directly relates to what we observed in the mushrooms, basically in Chernobyl, whereby the mechanism is this. So it is believed that melanin can be activated by light in the environment, whether it's gamma radiation or let's say UV light or the light from the sun. And when it gets stimulated, that it has the ability to split water molecules into free electrons. So this is actually how photosynthesis works in plants. There's a water splitting complex that involves chlorophyll, which is what gives the green parts of plants the green pigment. So the chlorophyll absorbs the photonic energy of sunlight, and it gets powered up enough to be able to activate this water splitting complex that allows electrons to be stripped out of water. And those free electrons can then basically power metabolism. And in plants, it's used to power the production of starch, essentially, glucose production. But in humans, the idea is that our melanin, basically it's even more efficient than chlorophyll at doing this. So chlorophyll can generate 2 electrons per water molecule. Melanin, in theory, can produce actually 4 free electrons per water molecule. So the idea is that these free electrons can be generated from this stimulation of melanin by some form of high energy light, and that would then allow those electrons to directly power metabolism. And there's melanin throughout the body as well. So not only in our skin, but also in the inner ear, the nasal mucosa, the oral mucosa, deep in the brain. And actually the primary defect in Parkinson's disease is loss of melanin over time within the substantia nigra. So melanin can actually be broken down to make dopamine. Both dopamine and melanin have the same precursor, which is called tyrosine. It's an amino acid. And so in a person with Parkinson's disease where these dopamine producing cells in the substantia nigra become toxic basically, and there's a lot of reasons why that might be. I believe that it's generally rooted in mitochondrial dysfunction within the brain, specifically within that part of the brain, because when those mitochondria become defunct, there's both the issue of what's causing them to have that issue to begin with, which is usually some form of oxidative stress or direct environmental influence that is impairing mitochondrial function. Then new melanin is struggled to be made because the mitochondria need to be active to make melanin. And then the body can compensate for a period of time by breaking down melanin to make dopamine versus making dopamine de novo from tyrosine. But over time, eventually, that ability wanes. And if you look at late-stage Parkinson's, it's highly associated with loss of melanin in the substantia nigra. And this is also coupled with the very interesting fact that virtually no patients of African origin, so people with dark skin, do not get Parkinson's disease. And there's this very interesting embryological origin of melanocytes. So melanocytes come from the same embryo origin as the brain tissue, the skin tissue, and the immune cells as well. And so they all come from neuroectoderm. And so there is this hypothesis that Jack has largely purported that melanin, like melanocytes, can actually travel in the body as needed. So if melanin is needed somewhere, I didn't mention this earlier, but melanin is also a potent antioxidant. It can quench reactive species in the environment. So if the body senses that there is inflammation or rampant reactive oxygen species in some part of the organism, it can send more melanocytes to the area to help quench some of that. And so the idea is that in patients and people with dark skin, that there's a higher capacity to allow melanin and melanocytes to mobilize where they would need to go to prevent diseases like Parkinson's that have directly to do with this melanin issue. So it's actually like a really interesting area of study that's kind of low-hanging fruit and not being looked at enough, in my opinion. But I think it opens the door, right, to a lot of counter-narrative questions, because the mainstream narrative tells you that there's no such thing as a healthy tan, despite the fact that we've, outlined all of these benefits of melanin for not only, the skin, but for the organism as a whole. So when you start to ask these questions about like Parkinson's and melanin and how people with dark skin don't get it, it opens the door for a lot of really other inconvenient questions.
Would it be fair to say somebody like me with generally really light skin, my heritage being from far north, that I'm in Ontario and say 8 months of the year I'm very pale, I barely get any sun, that I'm basically wasting a lot of the benefits I could be getting if I was down south and maintaining a tan and that melanin year round?
Yeah, so I would say it depends on how you're leveraging your environment. Like if you're really embracing cold and your mitochondria come from a more northern region, you could probably get away with it. The problem is that a lot of people, are living between 68 and 73 degrees year round. Cold is something that a lot of people just absolutely hate. And it kind of makes sense because I think we have like this ancestral trauma of like dying from freezing to death versus it's much harder to die from overheating. It can happen, but it's way less traumatic, I think. So it requires you easing into it. You don't want to go 0 to 100. But if you can embrace cold, your mitochondria are kind of primed to do that if they're uncoupled from these more northern regions. But there's the added issue of like if somebody already has some sort of chronic disease state, it can be really hard to undo that in the environment that they're currently in, that they develop that disease in. So oftentimes getting somebody to go down into more tropical areas for a period of time, even if it's just for a month or two, can really expedite that healing process because there's just so much more free energy you're able to harness from the environment down there because of the higher photonic energy of the sunlight that's available, as well as the light stability. It's just like 12 hours of light and 12 hours of dark every day. So it's very easy to get into a rhythm with your sleep patterns and like getting into circadian alignment. And it's just more enjoyable, right? To be outside. It's beautiful. So like there's just a lot of perks to being in an environment like that to expedite the healing process. And if you leverage high intensity sunlight with cold, that can expedite things even more because when you do that, you're not only getting tons of UV light from the outside in, you're also making a ton inside as well. So you're kind of hitting it from both directions, which can help to optimize essentially the biophysics of the system. And this goes back to Becker's work, actually, who confirmed that the body is made basically chock full of semiconductors that work the same way as the semiconductors that, the tech bros in Silicon Valley are studying for, developing new tech and what's in our cell phones and everything like that. Semiconductors allow the flow of, or permit the flow of electrons under certain conditions, but semiconductors work better under cooler conditions. So for us, what that means is as humans, if we get cold for longer periods of time, like what I typically do and recommend is a 55-degree cold plunge. And then I stay in there for like 25 to 45 minutes. And I do that 2 to 3 times a week, I would say. And staying in for that longer period of time allows your body temperature, your core temperature to go down. If you're only in for like 2 to 5 minutes, your skin temperature decreases, but your core temperature stays the same or actually increases because all that blood is being shunted inwards. So we actually want to stay in long enough to let the core temperature drop down, which allows all of the semiconductors throughout the body to work more efficiently. So melanin is a semiconductor. Collagen is a semiconductor. So you can think about all of the fascia networks throughout the body are made of semiconductors. Bone is a semiconductor. And actually, interestingly, Becker found that bone is literally a light-emitting diode. So it's an LED composed of the P-type semiconductor, collagen, and the N-type semiconductor, apatite. And together, they form a light-emitting diode that emits red-brown light. The issue is that you can't actually see the bone glowing because the light is retained within the system. It's not lost to the environment. So, and actually, this goes back to Roland Van Wyck's work, who has shown that if you look at the photons lost from somebody's body, it's actually predictive of whether or not they're sick or they're old. So the sicker you are and the older you are, the more photons you lose to your environment. And the younger and healthier you are, the more photons you retain. So you're actually bleeding less light. And you can kind of think about that as like you're retaining energy, right? You're not wasting energy into your environment. Instead, you're able to use it productively internally. And so that is reflected at the level of like using a photomultiplier on somebody's body and seeing less light emitted from the system.
You talked about this synergy for somebody who is sick, getting the light from being down south, plus mixing the cold in. Is there a way that they could push that too far?
I don't know. I mean, certainly there is. I mean, people can get way too much sun and people can get too much cold, and there's definitely considerations for women as it relates to cold. So from my personal experience, and from the experience of some clients as well, for women who are actively cycling, doing too cold for too long can be too much for the body. It can just be too much of a stressor. The woman's body needs less of a stressor to get the response. So I recommend women just like track their cycles and like track their hormones every morning with like an Anito or Mira fertility monitor. That allows you to measure estrogen, progesterone, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone, so that you can see, like, get a baseline for a month, and then you can see if you're, starting to do some cold plunging, if things are shifting around a lot, or if, things are changing in a negative way. But the sweet spot for me is like every other day at most, cold plunging for 25 to 45 minutes. And when I do that, my cycle is, perfect. There's no issues at all. And it also actually dramatically reduces PMS and menstrual cramps as well. So I actually highly recommend it for women. So there's that piece. Like, people can overdo cold, especially women. Men can tolerate much colder temperatures and longer times, typically speaking, but you still want to work up to doing that, right? So like when I first started plunging, even at 55 degrees, I was just doing like 2 minutes at a time, and I would do it like a couple times a day. And now I just, I'm so used to it now. And by used to it, I mean, I built up my brown fat to such an extent that like I can tolerate cold better now. Because the more you avoid cold, the more you deplete your brown fat, which is this metabolic and endocrine organ that exists within the body. That is, its job is to produce heat in response to cold. So there was actually some research suggesting that only about 10% of adults are walking around with any detectable brown fat, because everybody's sitting at this 68 to 73 degree temperature year round and never challenging themselves with cold exposure. But the benefit of this is that tissue is quite plastic. So even if you have a small amount, you can grow it back. And you can also make what's called bright fat or beige fat, which is a brown fat-like tissue that can develop within your white subcutaneous fat. So there was a lot of way to help build back your tolerance, even if you had been cold averse for many years. So you want to just start slow. Like, you can maybe start with just dunking your face in some ice water. Then you could work up to doing like cold packs on your core, and then maybe work up to cold plunging at like 70 degrees for a few minutes, and then work your way down to like 55 is the sweet spot, in my opinion, of being cold enough to work in a positive way on your biophysics, but also not so cold that you can't stay in for a long time safely. So it's kind of a sweet spot for that. And if you're doing that gradually, in the same way that you want to build your solar callus gradually, you also want to build your cold tolerance up gradually. And if you do that, you'll be able to tolerate quite a bit. And you'll know, because, once you start to become adapted, when you get in to that 55-degree water and you're in there for a couple minutes, you could then be in there for an hour and it feels like nothing. It just feels easy. That's literally your brown fat turning on and making that heat internally that's allowing you to adapt to the stimulus. So yeah, I would say there's definitely ways that people could overdo it, but as long as you're taking like a slower and steady approach to your sun exposure and your cold exposure, you're going to be setting yourself up for a win.
How do you feel about cold showers? Somebody that doesn't have a cold plunge.
Yeah.
You're making a face. Yeah, talk more about that.
I mean, they're just miserable. I just hate them. They just feel awful, right? Because like you're not able to fully immerse your body. So it's like part of you is freezing and the other part of you is not. And then you have to turn and then like it's just miserable. It just feels bad. But like it's still a benefit for your neurochemistry. Cold is a major stimulator of dopamine and norepinephrine. So it's really good for focus, cognition, energy levels. It's also going to be beneficial for helping to stimulate some of that brown fat to help give you some of that stimulus. But I would say the best kind of alternative solution would be if somebody has a bathtub to just fill that up instead and like submerge as much of themselves as they can into the bathtub water, because then you're going to get more of that global adaptive response throughout the body versus this very like piecemeal response that you get from a cold shower. But yeah, cold shower is definitely better than nothing at all. I would say cold baths is going to be the second best. And you can even get like chillers online for a couple $100 that will allow you to get your bath water a bit colder. For me here in Jersey in the wintertime, our water does get down to around 55 degrees, which is around optimal. But in the summertime around here, it's closer to 65, which if you're a beginner, you still may want to start around 65 or even a little bit warmer. So like, that's probably a great place to start. Otherwise, we now have the Morosco, so like we've had that for almost a year now, and so the forage is actually in the sun all day long. So when I plunge, it's also I'm like getting sun at the same time, and it is like a special type of magic when you're getting like the nice warm sun on your face and like your shoulders, but then the rest of you is just getting like chilled down. And the other benefit of the Morosco is it's also fully grounded. So when you get into that tub, it's kind of like going into the ocean in that you're getting like basically this soup of electrons that your body is able to access. And I also have like about 10 pounds of Epsom salts in the forage as well. So there's also the benefit of the magnesium and helping to relax the body. So yeah, it's wonderful if people feel so inclined and they like really want to take their, plunging to the next level. The forage is like the best on the market in my opinion.
I want to come back to DHA, and you did go deep into it before, and I think you may have touched on this piece. But I want to talk about the creation of energy from light by upping our DHA in the diet. And you talk about this in your ebook where you want people eating a certain amount of DHA to get this benefit.
Yeah, so there's actually maybe a little bit of an interesting distinction here. So I think melanin and DHA share some things in common. The melanin part of the story is really about harnessing photonic energy to make energy within the system. I mean, in theory, at least, we still have to flesh that out, but it seems very plausible. The DHA part of the story is really allowing your body also to harness photonic energy from the sun, but for a different purpose. So the DHA is going to help prevent burning also by maintaining a lower inflammatory state in the body, but it's also allowing you to, DHA is a really interesting thing because there are some like recycling mechanisms within the eyes and the brain that allow its levels and its like the molecules that are there to be retained and recycled in some way. But you might imagine that having a poor DHA status could actually result in people being less present, because you're literally not interfacing with as much of the energy from your environment, the photonic information from your environment that is actually giving you access to your sensory apparatus, basically. And so I don't think there's any research on this, but, it would be an interesting question to propose that, like, if we had a way that we could assess DHA status in the central nervous system, maybe a good proxy would be blood levels, for example. If there's a way to determine if somebody's awareness is actually influenced by that status, because like I mentioned earlier, that DHA is basically taking photons and converting them into electrical impulses that then allow the brain to process that information and make sense of it. So it's working at like a very fundamental level. that I think we still have like, some interesting questions that could be proposed there, but I definitely recommend people check out Dr. Crawford's work if they're interested in learning more on DHA, and he has some really great review papers on the quantum biologic mechanisms of how DHA is working. And yeah, it's very, very foundational and a super interesting topic to delve into.
In your opinion, when it comes to mitochondria, what's the best diet to support them?
Yeah, I would say a seasonal diet that's local to your area is the best bet, because when you eat foods that were grown in your environment, you're yoking your biology to your environment, which means that you're going to be more adapted to your environment. And so that's also beneficial from like an economic perspective as well, and an environmental perspective, because if you're supporting farmers that have good farming practices that are in your area, that means you're supporting these beneficial farming practices that are helping to renew the soils, and you're supporting, the animals being treated the right way and all these things, but you're also not relying on your food being flown halfway across the world to get to your plate. So you're also directly influencing the market on basically the global food supply chain, which is largely, I would argue, is probably one of the biggest sources of pollution in the modern world. We don't need to be eating avocados in the middle of winter in New Jersey. We don't need to be eating bananas and strawberries and all these things that aren't growing in our area. And there's actually a biologic benefit to that as well, because it turns out the deuterium content of seasonal foods also varies depending on the time of year. So, for example, in the summertime, like around now, there's lots of plant foods available that can grow here. And plant foods, by and large, have higher levels of deuterium, which is the heavy form of hydrogen. And I mentioned earlier the electron transport chain, which is what creates energy, water, and photons in the mitochondria. But the electron transport chain, and specifically the last complex of the chain, ATP synthase, gets gunked up by deuterium. So mitochondria hate deuterium. It doesn't belong anywhere near them. But when mitochondria become dysfunctional, deuterium can start to leach into that environment and kind of wreak havoc. So the body has some mechanisms to get rid of deuterium, including sweating, and including this melanin water splitting mechanism, because what this can do is basically melanin can both split water, but it can also reform it. We have this mechanistically worked out. I think in humans, we still have to prove that this is happening, but it makes sense from a first principles standpoint. But the interesting thing about this is that when melanin reforms water, it will only reform water with light hydrogen and not deuterium. So in essence, what's happening is that when melanin reforms water, it's deuterium depleting the water in the body. And this is important because the deuterium water, like deuterium-laden water, cannot get anywhere near the mitochondria because it starts to gunk up those engines. So if you're eating plant foods, and it's like around this time of year here in New Jersey, you're okay because the weather's warmer, you're sweating more, there's higher UV content, so you're stimulating that melanin more. Your body can handle more deuterium coming in through the diet. The major deuterium-rich foods include roots, fruits, and grains. The green parts of plants are low in deuterium because chloroplasts, like mitochondria, do not like deuterium. So green parts of plants, where the chlorophyll and the chloroplasts are low deuterium. Contrast that with diets in the winter. This latitude, the ground freezes in the winter, which means you can't grow plant foods, which means your diet should primarily consist of animal fats and proteins and seafood, perhaps. And so these foods are highly depleted in deuterium. So animal fats and proteins, animal fats in particular, are the lowest deuterium food. Proteins would be second. And so if you're eating these deuterium depleted foods during the wintertime, you're actually supporting your mitochondrial function, because in the absence of warm temperatures to facilitate sweating and high levels of UV light to help this deuterium depletion mechanism at the level of the water in the body, your body actually should be taking in less deuterium in order to function optimally in that season. And so it just turns out that eating foods that grow in your area or that were raised in your area are actually supporting your mitochondrial function via this deuterium mechanism as well. And there's actually a whole other mechanism as well relating to like microRNAs and other molecules like this that are exosomes and things like this that plants and animals in our environment can use to actually help regulate gene expression in our bodies, to yoke our biology to our environments. And so if you're eating local produce that was raised, in a good way, you're actually getting access to information that's also influencing the way your cells express themselves. So it actually goes quite deep.
Okay, this wouldn't apply to the information piece you brought up just now. And we're not recommending it, but for somebody that is eating plants up north in the winter, you mentioned sweating and light. Is there any way you could think of to hack that indoors? And more just to look at the physiology. Again, we're not recommending this because obviously we want to stick as close to nature as we can. And then also bring in deuterium depleted water. I know that's a way to hack it as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, people can use saunas in the winter. That's something that the Scandinavians figured out a long, long time ago, leveraging sauna and geothermal pools, and also doing contrast therapy with like ice plunging, going back and forth with that. They figured out that you could leverage sauna and geothermal pools to get access to infrared light when there's barely any available because the days are super short. So that's another way to provide light to your body in the absence of light from the sun. But when it comes to, dealing with deuterium from plant-based diets, let's say in the wintertime in high latitudes, leverage sweating. You can leverage also deuterium depleted water. The only thing I would say about that is that, I guess some of the main companies out there are not telling people they're supposed to dilute this water and not drink it straight. All of the research on using deuterium depleted water for cancer patients and type 2 diabetics, they found that the sweet spot for consumption of deuterium depleted water for creating health outcomes in these patients is between 105 and 120 parts per million. And so if you get like 5 parts per million deuterium depleted water, what that would look like is about a 1-to-4 dilution. So you would take 1 liter of 5 parts per million and add it into 3 liters of your regular drinking water to get to around 105 parts per million. And that's the water that you'd want to drink. In the context of cancer and diabetes, they're having patients do this for 12 weeks. And this is the only water that they're allowed to drink for that 12-week period, including like if they make tea or coffee or whatever, they're using that water. They're also instructed to eat low deuterium diets during that time. So mostly animal-based diets and or like leafy greens. So that would be another way to kind of offset some of the deuterium load coming in from like roots, fruits, and grains during the wintertime if you are like hell-bent on consuming them at that time. Those would be the main things that I would think of. And of course, if you're using like the Spurdy lamp as well, you're going to be getting some UV light from that. But I think for people who have uncoupled mitochondria, so more northern mitochondria from mom, and you live at a more northern latitude, leveraging cold is going to be more appropriate for you compared to leveraging something like a Spurdy. That doesn't mean you can't ever use the Spurdy, but I would say your body is really expecting to leverage the cold instead. So I would give it that if and when you can, versus the people with more coupled mitochondria who have darker skin and live at northern latitudes. Those are the individuals that would really benefit from using a Spurdy lamp or some form of a UV light device in the wintertime to help their biology cope with being in kind of a hostile environment for what they evolved or were designed to inhabit.
Okay, so mitochondria hate deuterium. It breaks them. Early in our conversation, I think you brought up metabolic water that is made by mitochondria. Is there any connection there?
Yeah, so the water that mitochondria make is deuterium-depleted metabolic water, so you don't need to drink deuterium-depleted water to get access to it. Your body is making a ton of it itself. The key, though, is that it needs to be exposed to near-infrared light all day long in order to do that optimally. We're meant to be bathed in near-infrared photons as long as the sun is up. And so that is what's allowing and stimulating the mitochondria to optimally make energy, water, and photons. And most people are not getting access to that near-infrared light because they're sitting indoors. So adding some of that back into the environment indoors or working outside is going to be your best bet for helping to support the production of deuterium-depleted water within your own cells.
All right, final question for you. If you were, say, on vacation, somewhere hot and sunny, and you had the day off and you could have the perfect light day, what different rays would you be looking to get at different times? And what would that look like for you throughout the day?
Yeah, so sunrise first, ideally at like around daybreak or like right when the sun pops over the horizon. When I was down in El Salvador over Thanksgiving, we were doing some morning sun gazing right as the sun was coming up, and it was incredible how quickly the sun moves at the equator, like, or near the equator. It was 13 north latitude. You can literally watch it moving. It's crazy. So you want to stay out for sunrise, and then ideally stay out into the transition into UVA rise as well, which you can also track on like the My Circadian app. If you don't want to use an app and you kind of just want to intuitively feel into it, what I noticed is in El Salvador, at least, when things are moving really fast, UVA rise was something like maybe 20 minutes after sunrise, compared to here, right this time of year, it's maybe like 40 minutes after, and in the winter, it's like 90 minutes after. So like things are moving much more slowly up here, but down there, you could really feel the transition from the sunrise light into the UVA rise, and it kind of adds, like, the way I describe it is like a little spicy kick, like a little bit of yang energy into the sunlight, like where sunrise feels very warm and nurturing. The UVA rise, like when the UVA light comes into the spectrum, it feels like a little bit of spice added in. And so you want to stay out into that transition, because UVA light is really important, not only for the nitric oxide story, but it also stimulates receptors on the skin and eyes called neuropsin, which is a UVA light detector. Interestingly enough, neuropsin is also present within the testes and is directly related to fertility and testosterone production. And so all of the like influencers out there that are sunning their balls, like, it's actually evidence informed, I would say. And that UVA light actually has a bit more ability to penetrate into the skin versus UVB. So you're actually getting that direct benefit of UVA light exposure onto the neuropsin receptors in the testes, but you're also, of course, getting the benefits of infrared light as well. You're getting the nitric oxide and blood flow benefits, and like across sexes, it's going to be beneficial to get as much skin as exposed as you want and as you can, to support sexual function and overall health and blood flow and cardiovascular function and all these things. So the UVA rise piece is really good. And then after UVA rise, the next milestone, I guess you would say, is like sometime around solar noon, which is when UVB and UVA light are at their peak. And so depending on how much melanin you've got and how much you can handle, that would be a time where you're maximizing your vitamin D and your POMC production from UVB light. And then, that kind of basically wanes and goes lower throughout the day, and then you approach sunset again, which kind of mimics what you get at sunrise. So I would repeat what I did at sunrise at sunset as well. And then starting at sunset is when, all lights are off. If any lights are coming on, they're going to be red. If there's any lights that aren't red, you're going to have blue blockers on, but ideally just helping to create that very dim lit red light environment if you're going to use anything at all. And then gradually wind down for bed. And if you're at that equatorial environment, it's very easy to just lock into a healthy sleep cycle. So like when I was in El Salvador, I was waking up at like 5:45 and I was going to bed at like 8. And I was just naturally really tired, right? Because we were getting intense sun during the day. I was locked in with like the sunrise and the UVA rise, and like I was super active and social throughout the day. So like I was ready to go to sleep very early, and it was very easy to get into that rhythm while I was there. And I think that's a lot of people's experience as well. So that's kind of what like the light milestones throughout the day would be: sunrise, UVA rise, midday, and sunset.
For somebody who is, say, really sick right now, and they want to optimize their light for everything we're talking about today, you mentioned this trip to El Salvador. Is there one specific place you could recommend that gets the best light year-round?
Well, I know even equatorial locations typically have like a rainy season and a dry season. So, I mean, I don't know if it's going to be perfect all the time, but I actually, speaking of places people can go, I know Dr. Francisco Gutierrez, who was on my podcast recently, he's opening a retreat center. I think it actually opened this month down in El Salvador, where people can come and stay and like kind of kickstart their healing process. And I think they have like cold and obviously like sunning decks and like good quality local foods and all the things. And, you can basically stay there and start to get into a healthy rhythm to help expedite your process. And then, you can go home, or you can, stay for however long, I imagine. But yeah, grounding all day, sunrise, good community, good food, like all the things. So that would be a really great option. And I think El Salvador is also very special because it has a lot of volcanic activity. And places with higher volcanic activity have better magnetic flux in the environment. So magnetism in the environment is like mana for mitochondria. It's like a superfood for them. And so I think that's another reason why El Salvador in particular is quite special with regards to not only having good quality sun and also great beaches and everything like that, but also this high magnetic flux. And that's kind of like a perfect trifecta for supporting mitochondrial health and overall healing, just by like, supporting the mitochondria at this very fundamental level. And I'll just say, like, personally, when I went down there, I had been dealing with some gut issues after having food poisoning. And within a day of being down there, all my symptoms went away. And by the end of my trip, on the 8th day, so 7 years prior, I was living in black mold and my health was kind of really crappy at the time. I had just started grad school at Princeton and like was super stressed all the time and like commuting a really long way. And I developed this mole like on my scalp line somewhere around here. And it was kind of like, it was pretty large and dark and kind of jagged. And I'm guessing it was probably like a low-grade basal cell carcinoma, but I had already had a lot of disdain for doctors. And I was like, maybe if it progresses or there's an issue or it starts to hurt, I'll go get it taken care of. But I just left it there. And on the 8th day of my stay in El Salvador, it literally fell off my head and there's nothing there now. So like I directly experienced, like there's something special about being on that land down there that is like not like I've experienced anywhere else. And so I definitely, and also given like, their economy is really burgeoning and like there's a lot of expats down there. It's like just a really good place to go. It's also not too far. It was literally a 4-hour flight from Jersey to get down there. And, it's not a huge country, so it's pretty easy to get around. There's, you can take Ubers and things like that, but there's also a lot of mitochondriacs down there already that are very welcoming and supportive to people who want to come down and support their healing process or like join the community. So it's a really good place to get a kind of like a kickstart if you're somebody who's really sick and looking to build some momentum early on so that you can help and build your body back in a good way that's like sustainable, and then you can build healthy habits and bring some of those back with you wherever you are, or maybe you end up moving down there. I know so many people have moved down there now, so it's like it's the trendy thing to do, and I don't blame them. I definitely want to get a second place down there. At some point, I'd also like to have a second branch of the lab down there as well, so we can study more equatorial sunlight compared to more northern sunlight as well. So there's lots of perks to being down there. But yeah, that's what I would say.
That's where Jack Cruz is, right?
Yes.
Were you staying with him?
Yes, I was there with him the whole time.
Nice. All right, Alexis, we're going to link up your website, your ebook, your social media. Really enjoyed this conversation. Super important, unique information that not a lot of people are sharing. So thank you for doing what you do. I appreciate you.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
How much serotonin you make when you get UVA light in mid-morning is going to dictate how much melatonin you can make later when you block blue light after sunset. So the storage of serotonin, that's going to be converted to melatonin later. So I tell